Okay.
Mr. Raffaello Pantucci and distinguished participants, we welcome you all to today's discussion on UK-China engagement. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of our major research centers. China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising powers mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct, foreign and security policies, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. It further addresses China's emergence in the face of the world in flux, domestic politics, economy, society, culture, People's Liberation Army, and Tibet Autonomous Region, and most importantly, her engagement with each of South Asian countries. To talk on this very important topic, we have Mr. Raffaello Pantucci. Raffaello Pantucci is a Senior Associate Fellow at Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies, UK. His research focus is on terrorism and counter-terrorism, as well as China's relation with its Western neighbors. He currently spends his time between London and Singapore. Prior to joining RUSI in London in 2013, Raffaello lived for over 3 years in Shanghai, where he was a visiting scholar at Shanghai Academy of Social Science. Before that, he worked in London at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and earlier than that, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He has also held position at the European Council of Foreign Relations and at the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. He is the author of We Love Death as You Love Life, Britain's Suburban Terrorists, published in London by Hurst and Oxford University Press, described by the Financial Times as the most articulate and carefully researched account of Britain's suburban terrorists to date. He is currently completing a writing project looking at China's interest in Central Asia under contract to a major publisher. His journal articles are appeared in Survival, The National Interest, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Terrorism and Political Violence, and RUSI Journal, amongst others. And his journalistic writing has appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Sunday Times, CNN, Guardian, Foreign Policy, South China Morning Post, and many others. Raffaello, you will have around 20 to 25 minutes, followed by questions and answers. We request our participants to drop questions in the Zoom chat box or at the comment below the Facebook Live. Please do not drop your contact details because we get lost in the questions. Raffaello, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pramod and nice colleagues for the kind invitation to come and talk to you today about UK-China relations. What I wanted to try to do in the 20 or 25 minutes that I have was sort of take you through a brief history of UK-China relations to try to explain how it is I think we got to where we are today and how I think the UK currently conceptualizes or sees its policy towards China. I would emphasize, of course, that I don't represent the British government in any way, shape or form. This is my independent analysis that's drawn on research and my own experiences. So, of course, I'm not going to go into the long and detailed history of UK's relations with China, going back to the Opium Wars and the East India Company and history and that sort of stuff. But what I will start with is more recently, I think Hong Kong, which has sort of brought the issue of China once again very much into focus of UK attention in 1997. That was kind of a big marker, I think, to start with for a lot of the kind of political actors we have at the moment in the United Kingdom and their kind of experiences and views on China. Handover was a very big moment for the sort of Conservative Party at the time. And so it was a big issue that has sort of been lingering in the background of British politics for some time, and specifically been quite a big event in the lives of a lot of the key actors. But in terms of China as a political issue within the United Kingdom, in terms of foreign and security policy, it's actually something which has only really started to blip onto the radar much more recently than that. I remember when I worked in Washington at CSIS back between 2003 and about 2007, I was there when there was a discussion in Europe about lifting the arms embargo that Europe had imposed on China in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. And after that, we've had sort of massive opprobrium from around the world about what China had been doing to its people. And there was a push by Europe in 2003 or 4 to say, well, actually, China has changed from the entity that it was in '89, and we need to recognize this, and we need to push to try to normalize our relationships with China to some degree. And one idea was to try to change the arms embargo, lift the arms embargo, and that would become a kind of focus of attention and would kind of help restart and reset the relationship that they thought needed to be reset with China. And I remember when I was working in Washington, this already caused a considerable amount of consternation. People in Washington immediately saw this as basically European defense companies pushing to open up a new market to themselves. There was less of the discussion around the lens of UK-China clash and conflict, which we see very much the focus now, but we can see that it was an issue that was sort of lingering in the background. At the time, of course, in 2004, the US was in the middle of having just launched its war in Iraq. So very much Iraq was the kind of dominating feature of the public discourse. And we're still seeing the whole fight in Afghanistan lingering in the background. But this sort of blipped up, and it blipped up when I was working there, and I remember focusing on it. And the interesting element of this, which I think is important and brings in the kind of UK element, was that at the time, the push from Brussels was very much in a direction of trying to lift this embargo. But then the pushback you saw from a lot of member states, and the UK, I'd argue, was at the front of this, was actually to say, well, actually, hold on a minute, maybe lifting the embargo isn't quite the right thing to do. But what we do need to do is reform the code of conduct that determines what arms sales should be undertaken to China. Because when people looked at the actual policy that the EU had, and at the time, of course, the UK being part of Europe, the UK was also signed up for this policy, it was actually a very loose sort of declaration, a very loose arms embargo that was open to all sorts of interpretations. And so the push instead was to define a more robust code of conduct for how any sort of sales of weapons or other big sort of piece of equipment to China was defined. And as I said, at the time, the UK was very much at the forefront of that. And I think the important thing to pull out of that discussion was that at the time already, the UK was kind of positioning itself as an actor that was trying to sort of sit somewhere in between. On the one hand, there was a recognition of the kind of US anger and concerns, but on the other hand, there was a desire to try to be pragmatic and to try to find a way through that would try to keep everybody sort of satisfied. Naturally, this wouldn't keep Beijing completely happy, but at the same time, it would at least be creating a policy which was not purely a kind of reflexive knee-jerk no, but was actually a more considered approach to dealing with the question of the arms embargo to China. But then I think after that moment where I would argue you saw sort of China relations blip up onto the radar, it very much kind of sank back again to being a back issue and an issue that wasn't the focus of attention, I think, of people in London. Of course, if you're a China watcher or if you're someone very focused on Asia, China was a kind of big issue that was driving forwards and changing, and the sort of transformation economically that we saw happen under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao was, momentous, and lots of people could see the sort of big opportunity that was bubbling, and we saw a lot of companies building and pushing in the direction of trying to engage with China. But from a political level, you didn't really see this registering as a major concern. And I think this was the story that you saw throughout the Labour years in government. And then when we had the general election in 2010, which Gordon Brown lost, and there was a coalition government that came in under David Cameron and Nick Clegg, this sort of big joint coalition of Liberal and Conservatives, we saw a change. And that change really started to come about with the appointment of George Osborne as Chancellor to the United Kingdom. And what you saw happen then was, whereas previously you hadn't really had a sort of clear policy or clear push being articulated towards China, there was a strategy document which was issued under the Gordon Brown document, and I think Gordon Brown government about 2009, which tried to lay out what the UK's strategic approach to China was, recognizing that this was an issue which was coming up on the horizon and did need to be thought about in a more sort of considered and strategic way. But there wasn't, it was kind of, the policy was a very broad one, and it was a very ambitious one. It was sort of sketching out a whole series of ambitious goals without really thinking through the sort of levers and what would actually need to be done to actually achieve the outcomes that were desired. And it was still not really, I would argue, a priority for the British government. Then with the arrival of the sort of Cameron government, or the joint government between the UK, between the Liberals and the Conservatives, you saw the arrival of George Osborne, and you saw very much a decision within government to actually try to really focus on China, and focus on China in a very specific way. And so whereas previously I would argue you did have a kind of broad sense of an engagement that was starting to happen, it was still happening in this relatively haphazard way, and it wasn't definitely the priority. Here you suddenly saw a government minister at a very senior level decide that this was an important issue which he wanted to drive forward, and drive it forwards from one of the important seats of state within the British government. And so we saw this idea emerging that China was this great power that was rising, and it was a great power that was very complicated. There was a great sort of potential opportunity there, but there was also a great challenge, and there was a recognition of the fact that China was rising in a way that, you know, was complicated for all of its neighbors, had all sorts of human rights issues attached to it that were very problematic, had all sorts of problems with, you know, residual issues around, you know, what was happening in Hong Kong, or what was happening as a result of leftovers from the sort of Tiananmen period. You know, and you very much had this sense that if we want to try to shape this power, which was on its way clearly to becoming, you know, one of the big powers sitting on the world stage, one of the great sort of economic forces, then one needed to think quite strategically and dynamically about how to do that. And the broad vision was, well, if you hug tightly, you'll be able to basically influence behavior in that way. And at the same time, gain some benefit from, you know, the opportunity which was clearly presenting itself. And to some degree, this was also, I think, reflected ultimately in the policy that you saw being advanced from Washington, where, you know, with the arrival of President Obama in Washington, you saw a definite push towards, you know, what was termed at the time as the Asia pivot, a desire to try to move Washington from being single-mindedly focused and mired in conflicts in the Middle East to instead being an Asian power that was trying to engage with Asia, but really ultimately was trying to recognize the fact that there was a real change happening in Asia. And a lot of this was centered around the fact that China was rising as this giant economic force, and that was having a huge centrifugal effect on the region around it, but also on the world more generally. There was a desire to try to engage and understand and influence. And so this was very much the kind of policy that was being advanced. And it was very much a policy that was being directed by the Chancellor of the Executive, George Osborne, and directed out of the Treasury. And what was interesting at the time is people can interpret it as saying it was really all about prosperity and economic opportunity, and it was to some degree. But in reality, I think that people slightly missed was what it meant was basically every sort of lever of, you know, influence and activity towards China was getting dragged towards the Treasury. And that meant, for example, the Treasury was for a while determining the UK's cyber policy and cyber thinking towards China, which isn't necessarily the natural place for it to sit. That doesn't necessarily mean that sort of prosperity took over as the vision of engaging on cyber questions, but it was more that all the strands started to go in that direction. And that, of course, meant that issues that probably didn't naturally sit there, that didn't necessarily have the people who would sort of be able to manage them effectively, weren't necessarily sort of sitting on top of the issues. So as a result, you had this sort of centralization of power and of effort around China, really focused around this one ministry that was really pushing it forward. But at the same time, it's worth remembering that there was also a lot of engagement happening in other parts of Asia as well. The UK and Japan, for example, have always had a very close strategic relationship, and under the Cameron Osborne years, it did get much closer. You saw attempts at engagement in Southeast Asia. It wasn't maybe prioritized in the same way as China was, but there was definitely some effort going in to try to engage with Southeast Asia. And similarly with South Asia. We saw with India in particular, there was an effort to try to engage with the great opportunity that was also seen as potentially emerging there. But it was very clear that the kind of center of gravity of Asia policy in London during that time was very much China, and it was directed around that. And so then what we see moving forwards after that was after, of course, in this sort of dominates the entire, Cameron administration from during the period of a coalition government all the way through to the election, which Mr. Cameron won quite definitively and decided then to rule alone, all the way up to the Brexit referendum, where we saw George Osborne and David Cameron get quite dramatically defenestrated from office from that election and ultimately pushed out. And we saw the arrival of Theresa May and a new government. And then at this point, we start to see a bit of a shift. The sort of codicil I'd add to this is that what was interesting about the entire China conversation during this period was it was very dominated by this whole narrative of golden age. It was very dominated about this narrative of engage and opportunity. But it really didn't filter into the sort of broader conversation. I returned to London from being based in Shanghai in 2013, in early 2013. And, you know, coming from Shanghai and in China, you know, I don't know how many people have been to China, but, you know, if you go there, China very much dominates the discourse. And it dominates the discourse in everything. And in particular, when you're thinking about foreign and security policy, which I was working on when I was based in Shanghai, you know, it is very much a discussion about China and then everything else. And it's all about China and how everything rotates around China. And so it was very strange to me to go from being based at a Chinese think tank where China was kind of the dominant issue, what was happening with Xi Jinping, what was happening with the Belt and Road when that finally emerged. All these issues were kind of the key things which are really completely overwhelming the entire public conversation, to then moving to London, where suddenly China was a footnote, frankly, in the sort of broader discourse and broader conversation. I would struggle on an average day to open the newspaper and find a China story. It just wasn't part of the conversation in 2013. And that was true at a political level as well. Within government, there were, of course, the China watchers, and there were, of course, a recognition of, you know, China as an important issue and something that needed to be thought about, and the golden age being sort of pushed forwards. And in the commercial community, it was recognized very much as a sort of big opportunity. But it really wasn't a kind of political discussion, and questions around some of the threats and issues that China posed were just not really engaged with. I mean, occasionally you'd see them bubbling up, but it really wasn't part of the issue. And this is why I would argue you did have this very kind of one-track policy towards China, because there really was no sort of political appetite or interest to focus on it. There was other things that people were interested in. Ultimately, the Brexit debate, which completely sort of overwhelmed everything. But with the arrival of Theresa May, you had the arrival in government of a government that did have some voices within it who were actually much more skeptical about this approach, and were very concerned in particular about some very specific commercial decisions that had been made under the Osborne-Cameron government, in terms of the decision to let China build some of the United Kingdom's nuclear infrastructure, but also some of the conversations about Huawei and the degree to which we had sort of let in Chinese companies into the national infrastructure. But at the same time, while these voices did start to emerge and emerge in influential places, the truth was there was no real push from the center to take over and own and push forwards a strategic view on China. And so what ended up happening within this period was, you know, now you had a moment where China was very much in ascendant. Xi Jinping had now been in power for a few years. He'd shown what a strong leader he was. He'd shown what he was doing with China. Belt and Road is the big narrative. China was coming out. This idea of sort of China rising as a power. I remember going to Beijing at the time, and the discourse was, how do we stop this idea of China as a rising power being the dominant thing? How do we say China is a risen power? You know, it was a much more confident Beijing you were talking about, and it was a much bigger story and, you know, issue on the world stage. And so it became something that you saw everybody had to sort of engage with. And so what we saw happen in London was this was reflected, where essentially every ministry, an agency, started to develop its own China policy. The embassy in Beijing became a very big, interesting hub for anyone who was interested in, you know, UK diplomacy or UK sort of policy in general. You saw Ministry of Education, you saw Ministry of, you know, Department of Culture, Department of Transport, every sort of department in the sun was ultimately developing its own China policy. And they were galloping in all the different directions. And because you didn't have a very strong center that was determining this is what our China policy is going to be, and then it was sort of filtering out like that, it was a much more sort of ground up approach. And this ended up meaning you had this incredibly schizophrenic policy towards China, where on the one hand, you had ministries that, you know, because of their own interests and outlooks on the world, for example, the Ministry of Defense, would look at China in a very skeptical light. They would see it as a power of great concern. They would side with their American partners and say, you know, oh, this rising power is something we need to be very worried about. On the other side of the ship, you'd go over and talk to people in Treasury who would instead see China as the great opportunity. They would talk about, you know, making the London Stock Exchange, Shanghai Stock Exchange work. They would talk about all the great opportunities there were. Or you go over to DFID and you'd find that the Department for International Development was seeing the great opportunities engaging in China in third locations. You saw the Ministry of Education seeing how it could try to get Mandarin. You know, you saw all these different departments running in all these different directions without a kind of strong center steering it forwards. And so that meant you had this very confused policy towards China with no clear kind of vision driving it forwards. And this was problematic not only within London and within Whitehall and creating this sense of schizophrenia towards China. But it was also very confusing for all our Asian partners beyond China, who, you know, had already grown concerned during the Oswald-Cameron years that, you know, the UK didn't really see Asia as a region. What it saw was China and then the rest of the region. You saw that kind of accentuated here, and you saw it accentuated in this incredibly confusing way, where they would see, if they talked to one side of the house in Whitehall, they would find people who were very much, you know, focused on them and very much, you know, concerned about their issues and understanding the lens that they saw China through and the concerns that they saw around Xi Jinping's China as this very assertive power within their neighborhood. But on the other side of the street, they'd find people who instead were thinking about China in a very different way, didn't really want to hear this conversation. So you ended up having this just very kind of schizophrenic policy. Now, this lasted, I would argue, through the kind of Theresa May, the brief Theresa May government, and then ultimately even into the early parts of the Boris Johnson government, where we saw it was, you know, policy in Whitehall has been so dominated by the Brexit debate and conversation that it has been impossible to get attention on anything else. Now, Boris Johnson is sort of, you know, now of course COVID has taken over as the big kind of determinant issue, but you know, we are seeing a bit of a shift, and we're seeing a bit of a shift, which is an attempt in some ways to try to rebalance, and an attempt to try to recapture the narrative and try to once again steer the conversation from the center and trying to determine what it is a China policy will be, and then get everything, all the levers of power and all the sort of players to follow that, rather than, as I say, what has sort of come out of, I would argue, the Theresa May period of this very schizophrenic policy of, you know, people rushing off in all sorts of different directions. And I think the reason we are seeing a bit of this crystallization around some sort of a policy, which I would argue still hasn't really been fully articulated, and is still needs to be sort of developed, it is in part, I think, a reflection of, you know, the turn that we've seen the United States take. You know, the US, Washington does have a lot of influence over British thinking. I think British thinking is still independent of the US, but it does, you know, there is some recognition that this is an important ally, and if an important ally is getting very agitated about something, it's something we need to take seriously and find a way to engage with. So I think it is in part a reflection of that. I think it's also a reflection of the genuine issues and concerns that people had sort of been, you know, were aware were happening, but maybe hadn't engaged with as fully as they should have before. So questions around what's been happening in Xinjiang, questions about what's been happening most recently in Hong Kong, issues around Taiwan, issues that Japan expresses regularly, and the UK-Japan security relationship is a very close one, concerns that Indian friends might have, you know, concerns of important allies who are all quite worried about China, and, you know, have been sort of ringing this bell for some time, and now are finding that London is actually sort of listening and saying, well, okay, we do need to think a little bit about this. And then partially also, I think it's part of a kind of what I would argue is a natural process that you have within kind of policy-making circles of when, you know, policy swings far in one direction. You know, and I would argue that under the sort of Oswald-Cameron years, the policy had very much, the pendulum of policy had swung very much in the engagement side. And, you know, now it was sort of swinging back in the other way. Ultimately, I believe the pendulum of policy should be somewhere in between. You know, you have to kind of thread the needle through these issues rather than being very Manichean, I think, in your view of the world. And so I think what we're seeing now is a bit of a rebalancing towards the center, where there is a recognition of some of the problems. There is a real recognition of the, you know, some fundamental problems that are posed by China. And these, I think, very much concord with some of the voices you hear in Washington, where there's a sense that, you know, after years of this attempt to, this policy of engage by hugging tight to try to influence behavior, there's a perception that China has definitely not gone in that direction. And this is something that is negative, and something that, you know, we need to therefore think again about whether that approach is actually delivering the outcome that we want. And, you know, there is a recognition that, you know, allies, very close allies of the United Kingdom are very concerned about China's behavior. And I'm not talking just about the United States, I'm talking about other Asian partners and others around the world. But at the same time, it's important to remember that, you know, and I think this is a key element of the policy thinking in London, which is why you saw, I don't think, have seen articulated this very clear vision for what the engagement policy with China will be and how we'll sort of execute it, is a recognition that China is now the world's second largest economy. It is becoming, and it is a major force in the world. And if you want to tackle some of the biggest issues on the planet that affect us all, be it climate change, be it, you know, questions around pandemics, future pandemics, and the current one. If you want to look at issues like peacekeeping, you want to look at developments in the third world, You want to think about, you know, some of the future norms that are going to be created and advanced around either the United Nations structures or around the internet or some of the other global commons that we all share. You're going to have to engage with China in some way as well. And so it's a recognition of the fact, you know, that China is still an important power in the world. And it's one that we do need to find a way of engaging with. I think very few people, well, actually, no, I think there are people in London who still believe that, you know, the world is not Manichean. And the world is not one where we have, you know, good guys and bad guys, and we need to just fight the bad guys and we can just sort of cut off from them. The idea of decoupling that is ventilated a lot in Washington now is one that I think a lot of people in London think is very, very difficult to see realistically being achieved, and one that they think would be incredibly damaging to the world and probably unnecessarily so. So what you are seeing instead is very much still this attempt by London to try to steer a path through the middle, where on the one hand you recognize the problems, you recognize, you know, clear-eyed what kind of a partner you're engaging with, and you push back on certain issues that you're worried about, but you recognize that there are issues where China is going to always be an important partner and one that you have to engage with in some way, shape, or form. And it's a matter of finding a way somewhere through the middle. And I would argue that a good way of looking at how, you know, there's kind of two anecdotes I'd offer as to why I think this, what I would argue is quite a realist approach to looking at China, is something that I think is threaded through the entire kind of UK-China relationship, even going back, I would argue, to the kind of golden era, as it was so called, was that even during the golden era, and Osborne and Cameron, people forget that there was a moment when the United Kingdom was very much put in to the sin bin, if you will, of China's foreign policy partners. After David Cameron met with the Dalai Lama, China complained very loudly, and then for the period of about, I think it was 18 months after that, UK government ministers could not get meetings with their counterparts in China. The embassy in Beijing was essentially locked out of any engagements with its counterparts. The ambassador couldn't get meetings there. We saw some very loud and rude things being said by sort of Beijing about what the United Kingdom was doing and the United Kingdom's perfidy. But importantly, throughout this period, and this was still during kind of what was described as the golden age, trade and investment between China and the United Kingdom continued to go up. And so there was this realization, there was a sense that in Beijing, you have got a partner that is quite a realist in his view of the world. And they make these sort of political noises, and they need to articulate this anger and this rage. And there's a recognition from the other side that we need to be firm about our lines, about meeting with the Dalai Lama or doing things which, you know, where China is overstepping a line which we don't agree with. But at the same time, a recognition that there are still other sides of the relationship that advance positively. And I think if what you're seeing now within the entire conversation around Huawei is kind of an articulation of this, where the UK is still trying to find a way to kind of thread its way through. On the one hand, there's a sense that we can manage the problems that Huawei poses, but at the same time, now that it looks like Huawei is not actually going to be able to deliver on the contracts that it signed up to because of the sanctions that are being imposed by the United States, there's some reconsideration of that. So it's very much a practical view of this rather than a kind of emotional view, and one that is predicated solely on this kind of very adversarial vision of China. And so I think this idea of trying to thread the needle of engagement and challenge, to use that old Chinese cliche, you know, is very much, I think, where UK-China engagement policy remains. And I think has been for some time. And I think trying to, as I say, balance that pendulum and find your way through the middle is the way London is, I think, trying to tackle it. So I will stop there. I'd be happy to pick up on anything I've talked about, answer any questions that people have. Pramod, I'm not sure how you handle the Q&A session in these, if you want to kind of steer the questions towards me, or if I just throw the floor open, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Raffaello. It was very interesting observation, and we have lots of questions, so I'm not going to summarize. Let me start with the first question. Like you talked about Huawei, so let me start from there. Like there was, it was in the news that UK is comfortable with China's BRI and it has accepted Huawei 5G program. But what is the current situation now, as there are news of US changing its position?
So I think, I'm not sure that I think the US has changed its position. I think the US's position has been, you know, at least rhetorically, has been relatively clear. Actually, sorry, let me rephrase that. So I think the question around Huawei and the UK's sort of approach decision to Huawei was that the decision to allow Huawei to build the kind of infrastructure was made, I think it was back in 2003. So it's some time back that we started to see Huawei producing kit that was being used in the British kind of telecoms infrastructure. And so British companies have kind of been advancing on the logic that this is the cheapest kit that's out there. It meets specifications, it goes in to the British system. And what's happened over time is that there's been some questions been raised about that and some questions around the security and integrity of it. And so we tried to see sort of solutions develop. And one solution that was developed was the creation of this thing called the Cell, where basically a group of Britain's cyber experts from GCHQ, the British cyber intelligence agency, were given sort of unfettered access to Huawei's kits before it was sort of deployed, and basically looked for backdoors and looked for problems. And they would report every year on the issues that they'd encountered or found in the technology. And they reported that they didn't find many backdoors that they knew of, but what they did find was a lot of sloppy workmanship. And if you go back and look at these reports, they regularly complain about the fact that Huawei has, not patched up problems. There's lots of sort of problems that need to be fixed. And it's really more about sloppy workmanship than it is necessarily about Chinese intelligence using this as a kind of vehicle in. And so that has kind of been the view of the Cell. And I think that has shaped the response that you've seen from, the British security services when they say about trying to manage Huawei coming into our digital and telecoms infrastructure. Their sense is that this is a problem that they can manage. And their sense is that, this is, as long as I think Huawei is kept out of certain key parts of the national infrastructure, basically there's no real problem with Huawei equipment being used in the United Kingdom. Now, what has changed recently is that I think while the United States has been talking for some time about, clamping down on Huawei, and, I remember when I was back in London last year and the year before, we were regularly getting briefing, visits from American delegations who kind of lecture us about Huawei and how evil they were and how we needed to go lecture our government about how they needed to, stop dithering and make a very firm decision about Huawei. But it was interesting to see that while this was kind of the rhetoric that was coming out, and we did see, I think, more than a year ago, President Trump say that he was going to, ban Huawei from doing any deals that, essentially sanction the company. As far as I know, the trigger was never actually pulled on those sanctions. Now, it might have finally been pulled now, but until relatively recently, it was not. And this was kind of confusing. And in fact, there was a general sense of confusion about American policy towards China, because while we heard from officials that there was a definite shift in Washington, and everyone in Washington was very firmly against China and very determined to sort of cut China out of the system and do all these things, you saw mixed messages coming out from the top in particular. And if we look at some of the comments that we saw coming out of President Trump about President Xi, and we look at what President Trump, for example, did with ZTE, the other big Chinese telecoms company, which was initially sanctioned, but then he personally overturned that. There was a sense that maybe, how real is this going to be? And so the decision was always on Huawei was like, well, we're going to advance, we're going to make it, we're going to let the company in, but, within limits, and then eventually we'll try to get out of the system. But for the time being, we want the 5G infrastructure. We want 5G, so we'll kind of go with it because we think it's manageable. Now, then what changed recently is it looked like the Americans might actually pull the trigger on the sanctions. And the change there would be that Huawei would no longer be able to deliver on the contract it signed, because it wouldn't have access to the equipment that it was buying from American contractors, which it needed to actually fulfill the contract in the United Kingdom. And so that kind of changes the dynamic. It means you're no longer, they're no longer the most attractive supplier because they can't deliver on what they're saying. So the shift has been very much kind of a pragmatic one, but it is somewhat linked to the United States in the sense that the United States is kind of hardening. On the BRI, it's a very different story, I would argue. I think on the BRI, the UK has always seen, there was some pressure from Beijing at one point for everyone to sign up to the BRI. And I think China kind of walked to it. They still want people to, but they're being less precious about it now. And there was a big push to try to get London to sign some sort of MOU, which was pushed back on, I think, quite sensibly, because, I mean, what country signs up to another country's foreign policy? But the sense around BRI has always been, this is essentially, I think, an articulation of China coming out. And in some places, BRI is a real opportunity for countries. And so in some places, and I've done work myself on some of these ideas in Central Asia and South Asia, there is a view from London that says, well, actually, we should be thinking about how do we engage with China on BRI in these countries, because ultimately the infrastructure and investment that's coming from BRI, as much as there might be problems around some of it, is a net benefit for these countries. And these are countries where DFID, for example, has invested a lot in terms of trying to, alleviate poverty and make these countries better. So actually, maybe it makes sense to engage with China. So I think on BRI, there's been an attempt to kind of disaggregate it a bit and try to focus on the constituent parts rather than the kind of grand foreign policy that President Xi was advancing. And rather than signing up to the whole thing, it's more saying, China, we see you're doing, this is your kind of foreign policies, you're articulating it. We see that there are opportunities, we'll engage on those, but we're not going to kind of sign up to your foreign policy wholesale. Thank you.
Like we have also been following Central Asia and South Asia. So let me ask, how do you view China's relation with Pakistan and the future of CPEC?
So I think, CPEC and China-Pakistan, I mean, the China-Pakistan relationship, I think, is one which, is higher than the Himalayas. So I think it's a very close relationship, and it has been for some time. But, it's one that has sort of tensions in its issues. But I think fundamentally, the idea of CPEC is one that, is broadly seen within Pakistani circles as an opportunity. I think where we see views changing, and I think at the moment, my sense is that they're swinging more towards seeing it as the opportunity side rather than the concerns, is a sense of Pakistan making sure that it's getting its benefits from this investment. And I think part of the problem has been in the past is that I'm not sure that, Pakistani planners had necessarily sat down and done the calculations of how it was they were going to turn this investment into something which was really benefiting them, and not just a kind of, a way for Chinese companies to build infrastructure outside of China. Because from Beijing's perspective, there is, part of the BRI is about, increasing, connectivity and opening up markets for China. Part of it's about getting Chinese companies out into the world and giving them opportunities using China's policy banks to give loans to countries that ultimately they use to use Chinese companies to implement projects, and build infrastructure in third countries. That kind of logic from Beijing's perspective is, a good one. It's sort of a way of keeping your economy moving, keeping your companies moving, and also increasing connectivity and opening up new markets for yourself. But the difficulty always is do the host countries then identify where it is that they get their benefit from this? And I think because of CPEC's kind of place as the kind of keynote project of the BRI as it's articulated, there's a lot of attention on that. And it was never clear to me on the visits I did to Pakistan in the past, looking at this specific question, that there had been that much thinking in detail about how it was. And the government wasn't necessarily standing up and pushing down to make sure that Pakistani interests were getting advanced as well. I think you've seen a bit of a rebalancing of that equation. And I think you've seen Beijing recognize that they need to put a bit more investment into making sure that that local benefit is being accrued. But I think it's still an open question in my mind about whether Pakistani plans have really been able to go in that direction. Now, of course, the problem is that geopolitics has decided to take over everything. And so now it's very difficult to have, a more robust conversation in some ways in Pakistan about these questions, because the kind of US-China clash, which has really come up as the kind of big issue, and the way that we saw parts of the State Department in particular, and also Congress, identify CPEC as a particular problem. And so that anger from Washington really, I think, turned, this conversation into a kind of with us or against us one. And it meant that having a kind of conversation about, well, is Pakistan really getting its due returns from CPEC, has kind of slipped a little bit from the radar, because the bigger conversation is now about the US-China clash and how does Pakistan kind of side up against that. The fact that we're now seeing tensions between India and China ratchet up as well is only, I think, going to accentuate that more and mean that the rhetoric between Pakistan and China will only get sort of more elevated, meaning that a sort of sophisticated conversation about some of these issues will get more crowded out because there's less political desire to focus on them.
What is UK's stand on US Indo-Pacific strategy?
I think the UK's view on the Indo-Pacific strategy specifically, I mean, I think the UK is still developing its China policy, frankly. I don't think it's been clearly articulated yet. I think we're edging in a direction, but I don't think it's been clearly spoken of and pushed forward. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy, there is a question that kind of hangs around it in London still as to exactly what it is that Washington is really trying to articulate, because it's not always very clear. If it's just a kind of robust military alliance against China, I think the United Kingdom would ask the question about, well, is everybody really on board for this? And it's not always clear that everyone is on board for that. You see skepticism from other members of this community who are kind of worried about the confrontational approach to China that this takes. I think there's another view that says, well, if you look at, you know, if you're trying to engage, trying to develop a kind of an Asia policy, a kind of non-China Asia policy that's as holistic as possible, you need to have an economic side to that as well. And the economic side was the famous TTIP, which President Trump pulled out of and sort of left scattered in the wind. And so the problem is that it's not clear what the Indo-Pacific strategy necessarily clearly is, and so what it is that we're actually engaging with. I think if you go to the Ministry of Defense, you talk to security planners, you can see that there is kind of a desire to maintain freedom of navigation as an important priority for, you know, making sure there's a free and open Pacific Ocean for everyone to use. I think that will continue to be a very important thing that the UK will focus on and be interested in. But I think in terms of how this Indo-Pacific strategy is completely articulated, I don't think it's entirely clear what it is, and so therefore how UK should necessarily respond. A final codicil I would say to this is I think you have seen a real push by London to try to broaden out its Asia engagements, and I think that's visible in terms of what the UK has done with its engagements with powers like India, with its engagement in terms of opening a lot more embassies in some of the Pacific Islands, in terms of opening more defense attaché posts across the kind of Southeast Asian region, and in terms of you know, appointing an ambassador ASEAN and really trying to make sure that the UK doesn't kind of fall out of some of the Asian engagements it was part of as a member of the EU, but now has to try to do individually. So there is, I think, a push in that direction, but it's been a bit gradual, and it's still, I think, suffering from the fact that London is a bit distracted.
Let's move to the next question. The European Union has changed its perception of China between 2019 and 2020 from a strategic partner to a systematic rival. Do you consider that in order to maintain a strategic stability, Britain should adopt a revisionist or a hostile policy towards China? I
think that, so I think on the European policy change, I think that seems, from my understanding, to be very driven by a sense in Brussels that, you know, there was a kind of, I think, a growing anger in particular from the business community that, you know, reciprocation that we were hoping for wasn't happening, and that China was actually, you know, on human rights issues, on trade issues, on business issues, really not coming back and receiving. And they, I think, got very frustrated in Brussels also by China's attempts to kind of pull the European Union apart, the creation of the 17+1 format of Central Eastern European countries, which was intended, you know, which was presented as a kind of hostile actor to Brussels, China's active engagement with parts of Europe that were kind of hostile to Brussels and undermining Brussels policies towards them. Yeah, I think it's also started to irritate a lot of people in Brussels to the point they said, well, actually, China is really becoming a bit of a systemic rival. There is still desire in Brussels to engage. So I think that is kind of the approach. I think the question of whether London should look at China in the same sort of light, I mean, I think that the approach that London should take is an approach that is based on the UK interests. You know, what is the UK national interest? And that should be where the focus lies. And I think that means that, you know, I don't think anyone wants to see a China, you know, that collapses in on itself. I think China is a great big economic powerhouse and force is potentially a positive force in the world, you know, and I think making sure that happens. But I think some of the things that China is doing are very problematic. And I think drawing the line on those, and I think the decision on Hong Kong in particular with, you know, offering a citizenship or a pathway to citizenship for British BNO, British National Overseas document holders, I think is a very positive act. And I think it reflects the fact that, you know, this is something where London is very concerned. And I think is drawing kind of a line in the sand for Beijing. But I don't think that doesn't mean that we don't need to still try to find ways of engaging with China, because on some of the biggest issues we all face today, China will be a big power and a big player. So, I think it's a matter of how do you kind of push that way through and make sure that your own national interest is served. And also, I think, make sure that you are engaging with other partners' interests. And so I think when we're thinking about China as kind of a revisionist actor, I think it kind of, you have to think about it, I would argue, in different ways. So I think in some contexts, actually, I would argue China is a bit of a status quo power. The way the world is currently constructed is one that has worked very well for China. China's gone from being a third world country to being, the world's second largest economy in, 3 short decades. And that is a product of the fact that we live in a globalized marketplace, a globalized world, that China can be the manufacturer of the world. So that China's very much benefited from global supply chains, global logistics chains, and done very well out of it. So in a way, that kind of structure is one that China likes. So in some ways, China is a status quo power. But on the other hand, if we look at China's activity, for example, in the South China Sea, if you look at how China defines some of its borders, how China sees its relationships with other powers, we can see that China is trying to kind of rewrite what it thinks is how things should be, and to some degree is trying to rewrite the rules. So if we look at Hong Kong, how they're reacting and acting there, on the one hand, they can say, yes, this is kind of a continuation of policy and it's a normalization. But on the other hand, it is kind of changing the parameters and changing, the agreement that they had signed in terms of China's, behavior in the South China Sea. The 9-dash line and how they kind of define what's theirs and what was other people's and how they're kind of claiming it. And it's, how they talk about and define their borders with India as well. There is a kind of revisionist side to China as well that you can see. But I think, I think from a UK perspective, I don't think it's possible to kind of be very dichotomous about it again, because I think, again, in different contexts, you're thinking about a kind of different China and a different issue. And I think the focus from London's perspective has to be, well, how does the UK national interest play into this?
Let me move to the next question. Is it possible for China to replace United States in Europe, as United States is the trusted partner in the West?
No, I don't see a situation where the European Union, replaces, where China replaces the United States as the European Union's key strategic ally. I do not see that happening anytime soon. I think, if we just look at a structure like NATO, which is still the bedrock of kind of transatlantic security and European security, it is an institution where the United States is the strongest actor, and notwithstanding President Trump's threats towards the institution, it remains a kind of bulwark of the transatlantic alliance. And I think from that perspective alone, I don't think you're ever going to see a situation where, well, never say never, in the distant future maybe, but I think in the medium and short-term future, the United States and China will continue to be very much close strategic allies, but allies that do disagree on stuff, which is always the case. I don't think anyone has a kind of relationship that is, that is so intimate you don't disagree. You do disagree on some things, and I think you are going to see disagreements on China between Europe and the United States, in much the same way as you'll see some issues where you'll see a greater proximity in some ways in perspectives between the European Union and China. If we think about climate change, for example, I think there are people in Europe who see China as an actor who is a bit closer to their thinking on climate change questions than the United States is.
Let me move to the next question. What is UK's stand on Hong Kong and China's Uyghur issue?
I think on the question of Hong Kong, I think the UK has been fairly clear on its perspective, which is that it believes that what China is currently doing with the national security law is essentially an infringement of the Sino-Chinese agreement, the Sino-British agreement, that was signed at handover, and believes that, this breach is one that is serious enough that it requires a British response. And I think London has done what is the right thing to do, which is essentially open its doors to the Hong Kongers who were born in the shade of this agreement, and who thought that the United Kingdom was the power that was there to look out for them on the international stage. So I think by offering them this pathway to citizenship, I think London is doing the right thing. And I think it reflects the fact that London is very concerned about what is happening in Hong Kong and recognizes its role, and is doing what it can to try to deal with this situation at a human level. There may be, I'm sure we'll get lots of rhetorical opprobrium and anger from the wolf warriors in Beijing, but I think London has decided that this is still something where a line has to be drawn, and that is, I think, a good thing.
Similarly, how is the fate of BRI project in UK and Europe?
I think, it varies, frankly. I mean, I think that, it's quite difficult to talk about BRI projects because, of course, I think after 2013 and the announcement by Xi Jinping of the Belt and Road, pretty much everything that was Chinese foreign policy became branded as BRI, from cultural exchanges to investments in infrastructure to, bilateral engagements on God knows what, everything became a kind of BRI project. So, to focus in particular on the infrastructure ones, let's say within the European context, I think they're continuing apace. Some of them in the UK in particular, you see, have ended up actually not coming through. Some of the investment in infrastructure in the north of England didn't actually come through in the end, but others are continuing. I think I don't think there's been any particular change in that. I certainly have not seen stories or reports of, BRI projects getting pulled. I think as a result of the kind of current tensions, what you see is natural attrition in some projects that don't quite work out and others which are sort of continuing. I think the pace of Chinese investment outward has slowed a bit, especially on some of these projects, but I think that reflects more a kind of economic slowdown generally, and in particular within China.
You mentioned about decoupling between US and China. Assuming if decoupling surfaces, what could be probable impact on Europe and Asia?
I mean, if decoupling is a reality, and I have to say that I think it's going to be a very difficult reality to achieve and deliver, because I'm not sure that people have really thought through the practicalities of it. The damage would be massive. I don't think we should kid ourselves. The idea that you're going to go from being a globalized world where basically wherever the cheapest manufacturer can be found is, you have kind of last minute supply chains that kind of deliver directly to order, that gets it ultimately means that we can get products at reasonable low prices. If that all falls apart, and I think it would if you really would try to push decoupling through in the aggressive way that it is, I think we'd see a massive increase in costs in products, and we'd, I think, see a real economic damage come as a result of it. Now, I think what you will actually see happen is not necessarily decoupling in a sort of comprehensive way, because I just don't think it's possible. I also think business would resist it, frankly, and continually find ways around it. I think what you will instead see is a focus maybe on certain supply chains. And so I think certain supply chains or certain things and products that people conclude it is important that you have a kind of greater degree of control over your supply chain, or at least have a greater ability to know that when trouble occurs in one area, you can replace it easily with something else, and that something else is, good. So for example, if we conclude that China is a real problem and one that we need to disengage with on tech issues, where are you going to get those products from instead? And identifying where that supply chain is going to go through, it does kind of make sense. So I think what you'll end up seeing is a partial kind of decoupling. I think the net result will be undoubtedly damage to some parts of the economy that will suffer, and I think you'll see some consumer goods probably see their prices go up slightly.
You have also looked at China's relation in Central Asia. So how do you look at China's role in Central Asia in general and Afghanistan in particular?
Well, first of all, I like the fact that you've included Afghanistan in Central Asia. It's a point of massive contention, but I'm glad to hear that when I'm talking to a Nepalese audience, you quite firmly see Afghanistan part of Central Asia. Certainly not everyone does see that. A lot of people with South Asia, I know it sits awkwardly in between. I think the roundabout of Asia was how President Ghani put it, and I think that's actually quite a nice way. The heart of Asia was the other one, of course. But anyway, sorry, I digress. I think that China's view on Afghanistan and Central Asia are linked but different. And I'm in the middle of writing a book on this subject, so I could bore you to tears about this for a long time. So I will restrain myself and be concise. But I would basically say that to look at Chinese engagement in Central Asia, you need to think about a few things. Number one, China's engagement in Central Asia goes back decades. This is not a recent series of events. It's always seen through the lens of BRI, but it had been happening for a good 15 years before BRI actually kind of materialized. Chinese engagement in Central Asia, the second thing to remember, is a lot about Xinjiang and a lot about developing Xinjiang. From Beijing's perspective, Xinjiang has always been a problematic region. It's a problematic region because it's got at its heart this kind of tension between these two communities of Uyghurs and Han, and it's seen as a kind of Wild West, faraway place that where trouble has kind of brewed in the past for Beijing. And so to try to change that, what you saw happen, and I think the riots that we saw in Urumqi in 2009 is an important marker for this, is you saw a real attempt to try to develop it economically. Now, I don't mean to downplay all the security side, which has also been happening in parallel, very aggressive crackdown. And I think some of the human rights abuses we're seeing at the moment in Xinjiang are truly awful. And I think are in a way an articulation of China's response, an attempt to kind of subjugate this region and turn it into stabilize it. But what they also recognize in Beijing is that if you're going to stabilize this region, you do need a sort of heavy hand on the security side, but you also need a big economic investment push. And so I think what you've seen happen over the years with Xinjiang is a push to invest in the region. But if you're going to invest in the region, you're going to have to invest in the region around it, because Xinjiang is as landlocked as any of the Central Asian countries it's next to. If you're sitting in Urumqi, you are, you're almost closer to Europe than you are to some parts of China. It's really so far away, and so central in the middle of kind of Eurasia, that it's very landlocked. So to open Xinjiang up, you really need to open up the regions next to it. And so I think a lot of what you've been seeing happening that's now articulated as BRI, in a way was an echo of what had been happening in Central Asia for a long time, in that you saw that to open up Xinjiang, to open up the region, you had to open up the area next to it. And that meant investment in infrastructure. It meant opening up markets. It also meant taking advantage of the commodities that exist within Central Asia. So you've seen a lot of kind of Chinese investment in infrastructure, in opening markets, in developing relationships with Central Asia, but ultimately it's to help strengthen, stabilize Xinjiang. And so that's kind of very much, I think, how China sees Central Asia. It sees it as a region that it is, it wants stable and secure, because in being stable and secure, Xinjiang will be stable and secure. So I think that's the kind of key driving message that I take away from the relation to Central Asia, but I can happily go on about that in more detail on lots of issues if everyone's interested. To touch on Afghanistan, I think Afghanistan's an interesting one because in a way it's adjacent to that. What was always interesting to me when you looked at some of the early maps of BRI was the BRI maps, which by the way, Beijing wasn't putting out. It was, Enterprise and Reporters, Xinhua and other places that were drawing them up. They always kind of had two corridors that left China from Xinjiang. One went through Central Asia, Russia, or across the Caspian, ultimately to European markets, and then another that went through Pakistan to the seas and then out. And so you had this kind of V, and in the middle of that V was Afghanistan. And to me, that was kind of a perfect articulation of Afghanistan's role within the kind of BRI. It was kind of an afterthought that Beijing hadn't really considered. I think Beijing's engagement with Afghanistan has been, I think for many years, it was kind of very much through Islamabad. It was very much directed through Islamabad and how they did that. China has a direct border with Afghanistan. It's about 70 kilometers in the Wahal corridor, the Washir Pass, which has been closed and has been closed for a very long time. It just is inaccessible, and it's kept inaccessible. I tried to drive up to it myself once, and my driver wouldn't go near it. I could just see it in the distance. But it's a very closed border. So I think China has, seen Afghanistan as kind of something you just kind of close the door. Now, what I think you've seen happen over the past few years is an attempt by China, recognizing that it had done lots of investment in Pakistan, lots of investment in Central Asia, but very little in Afghanistan. You did see an attempt to try to start to do something, but they've struggled, frankly, and they've struggled in terms of the big infrastructure projects they tried to do there. You saw Chinese companies coming and winning some projects under international, IFIs like World Bank or IMF or ADB, who were doing projects in Afghanistan, they'd use Chinese contractors. You saw Chinese extractors firms, CNPC, won a very big project, well, won a small project of oil contract up in Amu Darya in the north of Afghanistan, which is really gas that they're already mining across the border in Turkmenistan. And you saw them win famously the big copper mine in Mesainak, just east of Kabul in Logar province. And these two projects have been beset by problems ever since. You know, the Mesainak project was signed in 2007. It still hasn't started. And it's a source of much contention between Kabul and Beijing. You know, the infrastructure just hasn't really materialized. And what in fact you've seen happen from Beijing with Afghanistan is you've seen them hardening their borders with Afghanistan. So not only was their own direct border strengthened, but now you've also seen China investing in the Tajik-Afghan border and helping strengthen Tajik's ability to kind of protect itself there. You've seen investment in Gilgit-Baltistan to strengthen that side of the border, Pakistan's border with Afghanistan, which again would be a kind of easy route into China potentially. And you've seen China invest directly in forces, Afghan forces in Badakhshan in terms of training, in terms of equipment, in terms of building a base. And this is really, and they've created this kind of mini multilateral organization called this QCCM, the Quadrilateral Coordination and Cooperation Mechanism, which is essentially brings together the chiefs of army staff of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China, and they meet kind of regularly and they do kind of training stuff and discuss stuff together. Ultimately, it says it's about counter-terrorism cooperation and border cooperation. So from China's perspective, they've essentially strengthened their borders. And I think all of this flows from speeches that Xi Jinping gave when he visited Xinjiang in 2014. And he articulated a great deal of concern about what's happening in Afghanistan, how it might spill into Xinjiang, and a great deal of concern about what was happening in Xinjiang, where at the time, there was a perception from Beijing that the problems around ethnic violence and terrorism were getting a lot worse rather than getting better. And so from that, I think you start to see the crackdown, and the crackdown in terms of Afghanistan articulate itself as a hardening of the border, and within Xinjiang, all the terrible things we've seen happen since.
Let me move to the next question. How was China's response to COVID-19 in Europe in terms of health diplomacy? Was China active in Europe in assisting to fight the COVID-19?
Yes, I mean, China was very loud in terms of its support that it was sending to Europe in response to COVID-19. And a complaint I heard from colleagues in Brussels or European officials I spoke to was that, you know, in the early days of COVID in China, the European Union sent a lot of money and a lot of aid to China. And at the time, you know, Chinese diplomats made a big thing about saying, we appreciate this, but they were very careful to appreciate it kind of behind closed doors. They didn't make a lot of noise about it. And there was a sense in Brussels, they were like, that's fine. You know, we just want to help. So here's the aid, just deal with it, help yourselves, make yourselves healthy, and you know, that's fine. But then when China started to reciprocate, and when we saw the kind of problems in Europe really take off, you, I think, saw a kind of frustration in Brussels that China started to make a lot of noise around the health diplomacy that it was advancing, the medical diplomacy that it was advancing, and a sense that China was, was kind of trying to pick at wounds in a way within Europe. So in Italy in particular, I think there was a lot of anger in Brussels around how, you know, China had a very big point about sort of championing what it was sending to Italy and saying that it was doing this at a moment when, articulating politically that it was doing this at a moment when Italy wasn't receiving what it wanted to receive from its partner European countries. And to some degree, there is a question there. There was a bit of a failure in European solidarity in some moments. I think it was pretty overplayed because I think Brussels did still play a role, and I think European partners did help each other, and you have seen a lot of sort of solidarity coming together. And Beijing seemed to be trying to pick at this, in between different European countries, and it was a source of great consternation, I think, in Brussels, that and in other European capitals, that in some ways China was politicizing its response to COVID-19 and the aid it was giving, when Europe felt, well, we didn't do that when we sent it to you. We saw this as a kind of global response. So, I think there is a certain frustration around how the medical diplomacy story has played out. That on top of the fact that I think you've seen some questions now around, some of the issues around access to, personal protective equipment and other medical equipment that European powers wanted and found themselves unable to buy from China, and instead found China buying up from other places. So there's been all sorts of sort of political problems around that as well. But broadly speaking, I think China's medical diplomacy has not been very well received in Europe.
Let me move to next question. European Union is not dependent on China, but the members like Greece are dependent on China. Do you think this will lead to European Union disintegration, or does China have any intention or strategies?
So I think, I think there's a few things we have to unpack here. I think first of all, the European Union as an entity only exists in so much as its member states allow it to exist. We have to remember this. This is not a supranational entity that forces things down in the same way. It isn't like a federal Europe. It is ultimately a Europe that is only allowed to do what all of its member states allow it to do. And that's always an important thing to remember, because ultimately, whenever we see, discussions that power like Greece is more dependent on China than, for example, is on Brussels, I'm afraid I don't know the economics specifically in Greece and the numbers, but I would be very shocked if I was to discover that the investments that China has done in Piraeus and some other parts of Greek infrastructure are bigger than the amount of money that Brussels has invested in Europe. I would also be shocked to discover that if Greece's trade balance with the rest of Europe was bigger than its trade balance with China. I mean, we have to remember that, powers within the European Union are ones that ultimately are, European powers, and they are all tied together in this sort of web of economic interdependency, which is very strong. And even the poorer ones, or some of the ones on the fringes, these are countries that have received huge amounts of money from Brussels. And that's always an important detail to remember. So their loyalty, they may complain about Brussels, and they do complain about Brussels a lot. And often I think when we're seeing this question of them sort of siding with China over Brussels, it's really often about internal political dynamics. So if we look at a country like Hungary under Viktor Orban, this is a country which has had huge problems with Brussels. Brussels does not approve of Orban's, government and his political leanings, and there's been all sorts of problems and complaints. But he's still an EU member. But from his perspective, politically, Europe is kind of a whipping boy, and it's kind of a party that you complain about. And so in a way, by siding with China or appearing to side with China, you are kind of poking Brussels in the eye. And so it advances a kind of political narrative of what you actually want to do. And I think that's a lot of what you see happening. I think at the end of the day, I think China, I struggle to see China tearing the European Union apart. And the point I would make is that at certain moments, Europe does still come together. And I think, for example, if we go back and look at the last EU-China summit, there was a communique that came out, which is quite robust in terms of demanding things from China. If we look at the EU-China strategy, where it identified China as a systemic rival, these statements coming out from European institutions, that's coming out from all of the EU member states. That's the important thing to remember. Any one of them could veto this and block it, but they don't. And they don't because at the end of the day, a consensus is reached internally. And that consensus is one that we can see is shifting in a slightly more hostile direction. So that says to me that there is some ability for European coherence when it wants to. At the same time, it is quite easy to get Europe to kind of face off against each other and politically go against each other. And Europe, Brussels in general, is kind of a very useful, punching bag in some ways for European political leaders when they want to kind of blame problems on someone else. And so that's, I think, the dynamic you see playing out a lot. So I don't think that China will rip Europe apart in a way. And by the way, a final point I'd add on this, I don't think China wants to see a Europe that kind of falls apart into lots of constituent parts. I think China actually quite likes having a kind of single entity to engage with in some ways, because it just kind of gives you a clearer ability to engage with the single market. If you have a single market to engage with, you just do your agreements once and then you're kind of done. If you have to do it at each individual member state level, then it becomes a very complicated story.
We still have 10 to 15 minutes, so let me move to next phase of question. Like UK was the first European country to sign up the membership of New Asian Infrastructure Bank, AIIB. And China also promised that the new bank will be transparent and have high governance standard. However, China still struggles with its own transparency and governance issues, and is also facing a protracted battle against corruption. How will China ensure that AIIB really will be transparent and have world-class governance?
So, you know, a brief point I'll make on this is I know the UK has got a lot of political wind out of the fact that it signed up to AIIB, but actually it wasn't the first Western country that signed up to AIIB. Luxembourg was, in fact, and Luxembourg is always sort of reminded of that, and as few of them as there are. But the UK was very much, you know, it did sign up to the AIIB early, and I think it signed up to the AIIB because I think the UK saw that what China was trying to build with the AIIB was an institution that appeared to be answering, you know, a need in a way, which was there is a frustration in the developing world in particular that the international financial institution structure that we have is dominated by Western powers, and Western powers kind of don't let the others in, so to speak. And so in a way that was a realization, and I think the West failed in a way to open IMF and World Bank in particular to other powers. Now, I know there's lots of people from developing countries that work in these institutions, but at a kind of strategic leadership level, you just didn't see them as institutions that they could get into. And so there was an anger. And even if we look at ADB, which is a huge player, of course, in Asia, that is an institution which is perceived as being kind of locked up by Japan. You know, we see these big IFIs were all kind of crowded around and dominating the investment in this space, but there wasn't really one which was more open to everybody. And so I think what China was trying to create with AIIB was that. It was answering that kind of need that was there. And I think it did it. And I think the AIIB, as it's currently been constructed, and I've had interactions with some of their people, and I must say I find them a very professional outfit, and I do see them trying to aim for really an international standards of international financial institutions. And I would argue that actually they are kind of fulfilling that role as far as I've seen it so far. I haven't seen personally much evidence of huge amounts of interference from Beijing in terms of trying to steer another direction. The other point I make about AIIB is that, you know, I think the AIIB was a bit of a project that China thought they'd do and try out, and they invested ultimately not for what from Beijing's perspective there's a lot of money into it, but it really worked. Rhetorically, it really worked. And the other interesting was the amount of attention the AIIB got over Chinese bilateral investment everywhere. And so while everyone was focused on AIIB, as a proportion of Chinese outward investment under BRI, I mean, AIIB is a drop in the ocean. You know, if you look at what China Development Bank, what China Exim Bank, what ICBC, what Bank of China, you know, all these big Chinese policy banks are spending on, you know, BRI projects going out, it is of a magnitude bigger than the AIIB, which in a way is a distraction for this entire conversation. So I'd argue there's two parallel conversations happening here. On the one hand, there's Chinese investment going out, and on the other hand, there's AIIB. And AIIB, I think, was answering a need. I think China did something quite sensible and smart in the international policy space. Whether AIIB is able to kind of ascend to being a kind of peer to the World Bank and everything else, we shall see. We shall see when its projects start to come online. We shall see when investment sure and how it kind of grows as an institution. From what I've seen so far, it seems to be going in the right direction.
China is increasingly assertive in pushing its territorial claims in South China Sea, which has worried many of its neighbors. China also says it will not pursue hegemony and will stick to the path of peaceful development. Do you understand why so many of China's neighbors doubt these claims? How do you respond to accusations that China's activities in South China Sea could be worsening the security situation in the region?
Yeah, I mean, of course, well, not necessarily, of course, but I do agree with those perspectives. I think China is, you know, certainly China's behavior is making relations with all of its neighbors very tense. And I think China's belligerence and the kind of wolf warrior discourse that we see happening at the moment is quite understandably worrying, I think, if you're China's neighbors. And, you know, it's not that new in a way. I mean, what was it in 2013, I think, when Yang Jiechi went to, when his foreign minister went to a big ASEAN meeting and said, you know, there are big powers and small powers, and the implication was small powers should kind of know their place. I mean, that's not a very comforting, you know, view of the world if you're one of these small powers. So I can very much understand why people are concerned. And I think if we look at how China is behaving, I can understand where people's concerns stem from. So no, I think a lot of it is stemming from how China is behaving, and it is causing problems on China's periphery. So yes, I can well understand these concerns. I think Beijing doesn't see these concerns in the same way because I think, there is, I think, a real question in my mind about the degree to which they've stirred up a kind of sense of nationalism in the party in particular. And they've really they've been advancing this idea of China as this great power, as this world straddling power that dominates its domain. And that means you have to kind of follow through on a series of things. And so that means you have to be more assertive in these spaces and really dominate these spaces, because it fits against the broader narrative you're painting of your role as the CCP ruling this country. And it helps strengthen and ensure you stay in kind of control. And there's a fear, I think, in Beijing that if they loosen that a little bit and walk back from those things, that's a sign of weakness, and that sign of weakness might get interpreted as home as a loss of power and control, and might therefore mean that they're kind of open for a challenge. So I think it's all wrapped up in kind of the CCP's desire and need to kind of control.
Let me move to the last question for today. Two Chinese companies have a stake in the Hinkley Point nuclear power plant in southwest England. This is in line with plans announced by UK government to help Chinese firms in areas such as high-speed rail and nuclear powers to expand overseas. What role do you think Chinese companies play in the global market for such technology over the next decade? And do you think that opposition could derail China's participation in such projects overseas? Will such opposition lead to fresh trade frictions?
I'm sorry, Pramod, you slightly cut out there towards the end. I wonder if you could just repeat the last bit of the question, sorry.
Let me repeat the whole question. Two Chinese companies have a stake in the Hinkley nuclear power plant in southwest England. This is in line with plans announced by UK government to help Chinese firms in areas such as high-speed rail and nuclear power to expand overseas. What role do you think Chinese companies play in the global market for such technology over the next decade? Do you think that opposition could derail Chinese participation in such project overseas? Will such opposition lead to fresh trade frictions?
I mean, I think that the two you're talking about, nuclear and high-speed rail, I mean, the question in my mind is what, China's ultimately selling a product here. They're selling a product, which is their high-speed rail system or their nuclear power plants. And they're selling them. And I think the desire to get into a market like the United Kingdom was because they had a sense that if they could show that their products worked to a standard, that meant they were usable in a British context, then that meant they were kind of getting a seal of approval that put them at this very high standard, which would mean that then these companies go and sell it elsewhere around the world. I think ultimately it's kind of a commercial perspective, and ultimately China is developing some of these technologies and they are competitive. There are other competitors out there. Japan makes an incredible high-speed rail, which they've been selling around the world as well for quite some time. So I think that these are more commercial kind of entities. Now, there is a narrative that says that actually by, Chinese companies doing this is providing some sort of a backdoor for these firms in. And there is a question about whether these companies competing on an international stage are really doing it with a level playing field, because there is a lot of subsidies which they get at home, which means that when they try to compete, for example, against European companies or American companies or other nation companies, where you have really got sort of state subsidies aren't pushing them forwards, you are dealing with an unbalanced playing field. I think that's where the kind of problem lies with these companies. So it's a much more kind of commercial issue rather necessarily than anything else, I would argue. And I think when we're looking at high-speed rail, I think you are going to see more high-speed rail from China going up and showing up in other parts of the world, because some people will see it as something they want. They will see it as a benefit, and they will see it as a reasonable price and want to purchase it. I think nuclear people will be much more careful. I think some countries will go for a Chinese nuclear, but I think the key point to remember about nuclear is, I'm not sure what we think China's going to do here. I'm not sure we think. I struggle to see how it makes any sense for China to sell nuclear power stations around the world that will fail, or that will blow up on themselves, or that will cause problems. Because not only will that, cause complete disaster for that company will go out of business instantly. Who will ever want to buy a product from a company which delivers faulty nuclear power plants? But then also, from Chinese perspective internationally, I mean, it will look awful for them to do that. So I just don't see what the benefit is of delivering a faulty product within that perspective. There is a question, I suppose, about whether we think that China is getting up to that high standard, but I would hope that countries put in place, rigorous enough checks to ensure that any kind of Chinese investments happening in that space is meeting a very high standard that's required when you're dealing with something as sensitive as nuclear, or something as sensitive as high-speed rail, which you're potentially dealing with thousands of people getting hurt. So I think it's I think these are companies, Chinese companies, which go out on the world stage, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I think there's a question around subsidies, which one has to think about, but I think it's really going to be more of a commercial consideration than necessarily one that should be wrapped up in politics.
Thank you, Raffaello, for your time and interesting presentation. It was really a great learning experience about UK-China relations. We thank you for your valuable time. We'd also like to thank our participants for their kind presence and the questions. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Pramod.